Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our professional education series in spiritual care, mission, and ethics, hosted by the Ontario North and East region of the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care. My name is Robert Mundell, and it's my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today, author Chenxing Han, who's trained in hospital chaplaincy and seeks to diversify the field of spiritual care and contribute to the education of hospital chaplains and other spiritual caregivers. Chenxing completed a year-long residency in hospital chaplaincy and oncology at a hospital in Oakland, California. And she says that her teaching supervisors gave her the courage to write, saying to her that chaplaincy needs writers too. I couldn't agree more. Chenxing's first book is called Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists. And her new book is called One Long Listening, a memoir of grief, friendship, and spiritual care, which was released last week on April 11th. A very warm welcome to you, Chenxing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Robert, for this invitation, and thank you all for joining. Excuse me. And just want to thank you all first and foremost for the incredible work that you do. I have just such deep respect for chaplains, spiritual caregivers, and hope that in some small way my book can introduce just this entire field and this entire way of life, way of relating to people, to more people.
Wonderful. Our format for our conversation today, we'll have a conversation with you. I've prepared some questions, and also you suggested that you might like to lead off by reading some excerpts from your book. I think that'll be lovely. We'll have time for Q&A with you. People can put questions, comments in the chat, and also afterwards, we'll open it up to questions and comments. As I said, I'm recording this just exclusively for our members. I'll make the link available for folks. And I'll just add finally that I'd like to give away a couple free copies of your new book, Chenxing. So if anyone would like a copy, you can just send me or put your email address in the chat, and I'll do a sort of unofficial raffle for a free copy of the book and send it to you. I'm still waiting for my own copy, which will arrive tomorrow. So I was hoping to get it for today. Yeah. So looking forward to reading it myself, and really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about your book and experience in hospital chaplaincy. So I'll hand things over to you, and I'll add some questions, comments as we go along and see how things unfold. Okay?
Great.
Great.
I thought I would read mostly from the beginning of the book. And the book opens on, this is the book, One Long Listening, a memoir of grief, friendship, and spiritual care. The book opens on a bridge, and I thought I would read that to offer some orientation. The summer before she died, I visited the Musée Guimet for the first time. By then, the young woman who was once my college roommate had been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. She was 29. Like her two sisters, complications from the rare genetic disease Fanconi anemia would take her from the world. The largest collection of Asian art outside Asia sweeps all thoughts of FA and AML from my mind. In the museum's central atrium, I encountered Khmer sculptures so exquisite my chest aches. To stand in that pristine hall where the air is temperature controlled to a T, I had flown from Phnom Penh to Bangkok to Dubai to London, arriving in Paris by train. In Phnom Penh, I lived just around the corner from the National Museum of Cambodia, where pigeons meandered underfoot, bird poop graffitied the walls, and chickens clucked at ancient statuary. From the central courtyard, an occasional sultry breeze stirred human and avian visitors alike as we roamed inside the National Museum's open-air pavilions. Standing in that pristine and breezeless hall on the ground level of the Guimet, I ache for the Khmer sculptures there in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, so far from home. Homesickness and friendsickness, twin aches accompany my ascent to the museum dome. Up and up I go, tracing the spine of the uncoiling malga of the staircase. Here's what I can tell you about the structure of this memoir. I met it in the rotunda of the Guimé that day. 8,000 strips of tiger bamboo held together by nothing more than air and weave. A 6-tusked elephant spills from ceiling to floor. A tangle of roots cascades from trunk to earth. An ephemeral installation by the 4th-generation bamboo artist Sho Chiku Tanabe. Tanabe treats each tiny strip as if it were the whole, lets the bamboo breathe itself into being. Empty of form, formed of emptiness, the structure has no beginning or end. Fluid as a river, sure as one too, it evaporates all distinction between past and future, sickness and health, life and death. That domed room, free from birth and extinction, tarnish and purity, boon and loss, it was unbearable to leave. But one cannot live in rotundas forever. I descended the Naga staircase. Time resumed. Her cancer kept spreading, undeterred by the chemo, the radiation, the bone marrow transplant. Back in Phnom Penh, I couldn't get the Bon Iver song Woods out of my mind. I'm up in the woods. I'm down on my mind. I'm building a still to slow down the time. This book is that still, a mala bracelet of rumination-worn beads. In the beads that follow, proper names are largely absent. My reasons for this choice are twofold: to protect people's privacy and to honor the Asian cultures that have formed me. Pang Ayi and So Ayi are not reducible to their chubbiness or skinniness. When I call these aunties by their paired nicknames, I celebrate the friendship that gave rise to their playful monikers. We do not call each other by our full names. The omission endears us to each other. Galtran is among the Khmer Dharma song masters whose teachings resculpted the trajectory of my partner's life. Greeting me for the first time at her home in the Cambodian countryside, she cradles my face between her palms and calls me Gon. I call this revered teacher and blind grandmother Lok Ye, or Nekru. I would never address her as Galtran. The omission bespeaks respect. As in the 2 paragraphs above, virtually all of the Chinese, Khmer, and other Asian scripts in this book are translated in context. The unglossary on page 267 relays the pinyin for the Chinese characters, along with phonetic transcriptions for words in Thai, Khmer, and Japanese. Why such an oblique and incomplete method of translation? I wanted to convey, in this mala of a memoir, not only what chaplains do, but how chaplaincy feels. Choosing honesty over ease, I let the frustrations and opacities remain. I hope you'll indulge me this choice in the Buddhist spirit of 不知最亲切, not knowing is most intimate. The beads ahead do not conform to linear time. They circle primarily around 3 autumns of my life. In the fall of 2014, I began a year-long chaplaincy residency program in California. In the fall of 2015, I moved to Taiwan to spend a semester at a Buddhist college. In the fall of 2016, I was undone by a dear friend's too soon death. I've heard it said that there are as many ways to do chaplaincy as there are chaplains. This book is about one chaplain's way. And I thought I would just read a few of the beads to give a sense of the book. My aunt helps me find the words to introduce myself to Chinese-speaking patients at the hospital. This is the aunt who lives in Shanghai, who once thoroughly trounced me at a game of Scrabble when she visited us in Seattle. Footnote. Only teenage hubris can explain my surprise at having lost to a woman who read dictionaries cover to cover during the Cultural Revolution. Did I mention she's a translator and writer? End of footnote. We agree that 宗教师, religious teacher, sounds too literal, while 精神支持, spiritual support, supporter sounds a bit stiff. She muses, in Chinese, 精神疏导 or 心理疏导 is quite an occupational term, but 关怀 may sound more humane. Alternatively, you can use 人文关怀 or 心灵关怀, which are both suitable in this case, but maybe too extensive in meaning. 神职人员 is awkward for non-believers, but still embraces a broader sense than 牧师, which is strictly used in the Christian context. 牧师, shepherd teacher, is the translation I encounter most often. But the Lord is not my shepherd, and a hospital chaplain's flock is not exclusively Christian, especially not here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I end up explaining not who I am, but what I do, 精神与心理关怀, or simply 关怀. The chaplain's job distilled to a single word, care. And I think maybe read just a couple more short reads. Part of the memoir is structured as letters to my friend Amy, who I opened with. A letter to the young woman who was once my college roommate. Dearest, you said fall is the most honest season. It does not pretend that life blooms forever. People could be excused for thinking only of summer upon first meeting you, your petite frame alight with that unruly crest of golden curls. We could be excused for thinking your life would bloom forever, even though you knew from an impossibly early age that it would be more evanescent than most. Fall, your favorite season, the season of cold and sun, rain and warmth, clear mornings and color-soaked trees, everywhere reminders of impermanence. Please excuse me, 原谅我, 靠不谈透, 許してください, so much yesterday, in all the languages I know or half know or barely know. Please forgive me, poor student of the most basic of Buddhist tenets. All phenomena arise and pass away. Still, that final fall came so swiftly. I had dared to hope for a dozen more. On sunny days, 2 dozen. And in my hope, I grew forgetful. And I'll just read one more short read. Passed with impromptu prayer at the foot of M's hospital deathbed, I borrow her family's belief in God, scrounge courage in sips of scrubbed air. Amid garbled generalities, a specificity tumbles from my trembling tongue at the sight of her painted toenails. This is a woman with style. Her family smiles. Holy and human witnesses to colorful keratin and the absence of breath. Wistfully, her sister says to the stillness, girl, I am going to miss seeing you in those stilettos. Thank you.
Wow, those are really beautiful excerpts that you read and provide such a nice introduction to your book and your approach, which is so open and interesting with such a variety of approaches, you know, this mala bracelet imagery, these beads that you follow, and like a love letter to your friend, and just the very poetic way that you write does strike me very much like that, a love letter, multilingual approach, just drawing in these different languages, the sort of loose or open translations, just drawing them in to experience them really. So many questions. I'd like to open it up to anybody who has some questions or comments. Please do put them in the chat or just jump in. I was struck by what you said, the Buddhist approach, and it's something we, trying to expand our own minds beyond the Christian tradition and hospital chaplaincy, the multicultural, multi-faith aspects of this. And it's so interesting and helpful to hear you talk about Buddhist approaches. And something you said just struck me as so interesting, that this not knowing is the most intimate. Can you say more perhaps about how you practice that not knowing?
Sure. Yeah, that expression is sometimes heard in Zen communities. So, Buddhism, like Christianity, like all faiths, is itself incredibly diverse, and there are many traditions. But that phrase in particular always struck me as being so close to the truth of what doing chaplaincy feels like. Walking into any patient's room always felt to me like walking into a whole world where I had no idea what to expect there. And of course, within me, there would be a desire, I think, to control the situation to a certain extent, to control what I don't know, whether it was, I want this visit to go well, whatever that means to me. I want to look good. Like, the ego is always kind of there in the background. And so this kind of practice of relinquishing a certain degree of control, of recognizing things are all impermanent, things are always changing, and therefore everything's unpredictable. Even if I saw this patient last week, they are going to be in a completely different space. And so going in with this kind of beginner's mind, and the Suzuki Roshi book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, people often quote this expression. He says that in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. And I would notice there's a way in which going in without a particular agenda, I think spiritual caregivers are grounded deeply in values, in an approach, and that will come from our personal theologies. For me, for example, it may be about reducing suffering, but the practice of spiritual care is itself, I think, so creative. There's so many ways. It's unscripted, right? I started out maybe naively thinking, and I think many people do, oh, like if I just go in and maybe there's a prayer and then everything will be better. And as you all know, it's far more complicated than that. And so practicing not knowing is most intimate is, I think, partly an act of humility, of what does it look like to just confront the truth that I don't know how this encounter will go. I can have certain aspirations and intentions. Those are very important. And then I kind of have to be open to a variety of possibilities, including open to being shut out of that room, being driven out of that room, being cursed out of that room. And then I think the question becomes, how do I get intimate with the not knowing, and also get intimate with the consequences of that? For example, am I offended when I'm driven out of that room? Or can I have a bit of a sense of humor, or even maybe a sense of delight that, wow, I am the one person this person can kick out of their room, which you can't really do in the same way with the doctor or the nurse or the phlebotomist or whoever else. And so it's interesting that the more I wrote this book and the more I did chaplaincy, I think like people who haven't done it will think like, oh, it's so depressing, it's all about death and etc. But I think the chaplains I most admire actually have this very playful spirit to them, and in a way that's essential to self-care, to making this kind of work sustainable. So for me, that's at the core, and I continue to struggle with it because I'm someone who still can't help but want to have assurance that this will go well, and this I want to know what's going to happen. And of course, I can't know. And so it's this ongoing dance. It's almost like a bit of a koan that I continue to grapple with on an ongoing basis, even as a non-badge wearing chaplain, as I say now, that I do spiritual care in different forms in the world, not in a hospital setting. But that training was just so invaluable.
And would you say that that Buddhist tradition, Buddhist text, that sort of not knowing openness has influenced your approach to storytelling, or just the way you tell your story and have written your book? Say more about the connection there, what that means to you.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. That's such a great question. I think very much so. I mean, even the way this book came to be, I never set out to write this book. And it was really another college friend of mine who said, oh, you're doing this year-long residency in chaplaincy. I don't really know what that is, and maybe you could write about it. And I thought, oh, I don't even know if I really know what this is, so maybe I should write about it, because for me, writing has always been a way to kind of process and understand and reflect. And it was very much not
provide everything in English and French and the way, like,
reply to her, to Marianne.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Not knowing how this book would emerge. And in some ways, it emerged much like a collage. So I had verbatims from CPE, I had hospital encounters, there's a lot of writing one does in clinical pastoral education. And then really it was, I think the year after I finished my CPE, I was in a Taiwanese Buddhist monastery. So I was writing some reflections there. And then when my friend Amy died, kind of quite spontaneously, the book took on a different shape. And Amy was such a master of collages. Actually, she would sometimes spend years making a collage for someone she loved. It just took her that long to find the pieces of art, this place and that place. And in a way, I think of this book partly as a collage of words, a gift of words for Amy herself, that even in her death, I was still able to remain in relationship. And of course, I had no idea what form this book would take. At one point, there were just in multiple rooms of the house, little scraps of paper taped onto the wall that would be moving here and there and everywhere, kind of finding their kindred scraps of paper. And the book now ultimately is structured on, there's 7 different parts, but there's a real, I think, openness to the book, which may be disorienting, maybe even frustrating to some people, I think, as I sort of acknowledge in the bridge. And yet for me, this felt very much like, again, what spiritual care feels like. We sometimes want our stories to have a very tidy beginning, middle, and end. But in a way, I think of chaplains stepping into this hinge moment of people's lives. We haven't generally known them before this point. And after they leave the hospital, we may never see them again. And yet we meet them at such a critical time. And so there's a kind of intensity to that moment. Again, I think shaped by this not knowing. And I wanted to capture that in the book as well, that there are little vignettes in here. There are stories that are longer, and yet there's a way in which I have to acknowledge, I don't know where the patients in this book are now, right? Including the ones who died. I do not know where they are. Even if people ask me, where is grandma gone now that she's dead? Where is my mother now? And I think that I hope the writing conveys a little bit of that. I think there's a way in which, too, this is a memoir of grief. And for me, I was always fascinated by, we have ideas about like 5 stages of grief, but I think that has changed over time, which I think was very valuable when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross presented that. And I think different perspectives on grief are valuable. And I'm really curious about what it means not to pathologize grief, but to grieve more communally and collectively. And for me, grief is such a fascinating emotion, itself always very impermanent, always changing, and not always one with a beginning, middle, and end. I often think we're born into certain forms of grief, whether they come from our family, whether they come from our nation, and particular karmic forces or particular historical griefs that we are all born into. And I think sometimes we die into it too, which is not to say we're not also born into joy and so many other emotions as well. But I think, this is just such a rich question. So I kind of wanted to convey that too, like I say very explicitly in the bridge of the book. There's not necessarily a beginning, middle, or end. And yet I believe that one can still be transformed by these encounters in spite of that. And that's also a very Buddhist idea. Like within Buddhism, there's not an origin story. There's not a creator of the world. There are stories that can say it's kind of like time goes back immemorial. And so the book also has a Buddhist sensibility, since I myself as a Buddhist was writing it.
And part of this idea of the collage, which is so evocative, and this open approach or open appreciation of grief. And in the excerpts you were reading at the beginning, there were so many different places that you were in and describing. And you've said that this book is as much a travel memoir as it is a grief memoir. What's the connection for you between mourning and moving or movement or places?
Yeah, so I guess for context, which might be helpful, I was born in Shanghai, and then in the early 90s, at the age of 4, I immigrated to the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, lived in various places around there, and then moved to Seattle, Washington. And then I took a gap year through Asia and went to college in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I've been there for, here for almost 2 decades, but I've also spent time in places like South Africa and also particularly Taiwan, a little China, and also Thailand and Cambodia. And so in a way, I didn't set out to write a travel memoir, but my first encounter with chaplaincy was actually in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, with a Buddhist chaplaincy organization called Brahma Vihara. They worked primarily with people with HIV/AIDS and very usually a quite indigent population. And so I think that was maybe a little unusual, since chaplaincy within the US, and I'm guessing Canada as well, is still more shaped by being it's Christian history, it's Christian roots. Of course, it's diversified greatly and continues to do so in that time. But having my first encounter be a very interesting Cambodian Buddhist chaplaincy organization run by a Zen nun, an American Zen nun with a Cambodian staff. They were really who I apprenticed with first in this act of spiritual care. And it was very humbling. I'd just gotten my undergraduate degree and I realized nothing I'd really learned there had prepared me to be with people who were dying and whose language I didn't speak. So I speak Shanghai, I speak Mandarin, I understand Shanghainese, I don't speak Khmer or Khmer. And so there's something about being there. And then again, like I said, we encounter people from so many different cultural backgrounds, so many different linguistic backgrounds within spiritual care. And after my residency, as I allude to throughout the book, I became actually quite burnt out. And I spent a summer at a Buddhist college in Taiwan. And so I guess this really big question of mourning and mourning movement, I think there's maybe a lot of ways I could answer that question, but one that immediately comes to mind is that I know sometimes when people are in the midst of grief, it can feel very stuck, or it can feel like this horrible or overwhelming feeling can feel like it's going to be going on forever. And I think, though, there's a way in which if we attend and attune really closely to that feeling of mourning, to that grief, we start to notice all the different textures and all the different shapes and how it itself is also moving and changing all the time. And I think there's a way in which, to me, travel, like being put very much into a new environment, my ears are listening and attuning to new sounds, and there's new smells. So there's a very embodied and sensory way in which I think people like to travel, because it kind of gets us out of our usual habits, our usual places and spaces. And I've always thought doing spiritual care chaplaincy was a kind of incredible travel where you might never have to leave your town or the region, but you'll get to meet people that other people never get to meet. I think I once heard a chaplain say oh, we have the best seat in the house, which is not always what people think. Many people are always fleeing that room because they're frightened to encounter death or illness. And, I would say it's not just the best seat of the house, it's the best, play that we could possibly be in, to be in these deep relationships with people whom we might not otherwise have the privilege to encounter. Feels to me very much like a kind of, the way ideal travel feels to me, where we all open each other's worlds a little bit broader to people across these vast lines of difference.
Fascinating. Questions and comments from participants? Dan or Suzanne, any reflections from your own Buddhist perspectives on this? Or anything at all? Perhaps you could say more about burnout. That's something that so many healthcare practitioners are confronting these days, the stressful environments in healthcare, and burnout in spiritual care is unique and something you've experienced and tended to by going off, was it to the Buddhist college, or you spent time in a Buddhist monastery? What have you learned in your own experience about burnout and self-care? What did you get out of that Buddhist context, that Buddhist approach to care for yourself?
Yeah, this is such an important question. I think I'm a bit unusual in that I entered this year-long residency kind of with the suspicion that I probably would not go into full-time chaplaincy as a badge-wearing chaplain, as I said, but that I was certain that it would be a really informative, just life-changing kind of education. And up to that point, I'd done chaplaincy training in Cambodia, I'd done a chaplaincy training in San Francisco with the Sati Buddhist chaplaincy program. And I'd realized, I was also usually juggling 2 or 3 part-time jobs, things related to hospice and so forth. And I remember thinking, I really need to devote a year of my life to this. That was also a particularly difficult year of my life where there were various traumas that were occurring in my life. And so it became a way, I think, that kind of action reflection model of chaplaincy, what it really urges us to do, I think, is to ask deeply into this question of self-care and of burnout. If one's intention and aspiration is to sustain the practice of spiritual care over the long term, then I think both there's a way in which this is, I think, a communal question that we are asking and need to continue to ask. I think what makes it very, very challenging is the particular systems that are in place. And so, for example, at the hospital where I worked, it was amazing to have supervisors who had set up a program where we did not have quotas. We went to where we were called, and sometimes that was a lot in a day, but always self-care was central. They said, be unwavering in your self-care. And not all programs are like that. Some programs have a different ethos, a different culture. I think some hospital systems have a different ethos and a different culture. So to me, I think there's also these broader systemic questions at play, and acknowledging them, frankly, acknowledging that no sane person sometimes can do what certain systems are expecting them to do. And then I think it becomes this question of, are we able to change the system, or are we able to navigate this in a way that protects ourselves or protects the caregiver? I think within Buddhist thought, there's very much, there's this complicated notion of not self, like there's no permanent core thing we can call the self. The way I tend to relate to that concept is that I'm reminded that what I call myself is a very relational thing. And so who I am is in relation to my parents, my family, my ancestors, my communities, my colleagues, right? And to be within nourishing relationships throughout, that's incredibly important. And I think there's a way in which the notion of self-care can get kind of very reduced to a very individual self-care. So, if you just did this checklist of things, you should feel better, and then you should just continue on with life as normal. But I think, as all of us learned during the pandemic, that may not be a desirable thing. Life as usual may not actually be the kinds of lives we want to live. And so I think these questions of burnout and self-care, if there's a way we can avoid the temptation to look at checklists, find the magic bullet to cure everything, but think more systemically, think more relationally, and ask these questions with others who are also engaged, I would say, in creative arts. And because I see spiritual care as a creative art. There's so many ways that one is just required to be so creative in this work. The different tools that you're bringing and drawing from, poetry, music, it could even just be something at the grocery store that sparked an insight that you then connect with the patient in the room. But I think to do that kind of work, to be creative, we need to be rested. We ourselves need to be taken care of. I think I write at a certain point of the book, this realization, I am not exempted from the blessings and the prayers I am giving in the hospital. I would receive blessings from patients. And at first it would feel like, oh, no, I don't need those. I'm the chaplain, I'm fine. And so I think, what does it mean to bring our whole vulnerable selves to this work? And what does it mean to have systems that recognize chaplains are vulnerable human beings too? Things happen in chaplains' lives where a death, something unexpected. And then at those points, we chaplains need chaplains too. That's one of the messages of my book. We need the spiritual care. When I was at the bedside of my friend who was dying, I wasn't her chaplain. I was her friend then. I was her loving friend, and I was her grieving friend. And I was not in a position in that moment to be a chaplain. So I really hope that collectively, communally, we keep asking this question around burnout and spiritual care. And I hope that leads to certain forms of systemic change that make it so sabbaticals are more built in, make it so that people are able to do retreat, have moments, have not just moments, but periods of time where they're able to rejuvenate, refresh. And anyway, it's just a question that I feel very passionate about, and I'm glad that you've asked it.
So interesting what you said about spiritual care being a creative art or a creative act. That's a question I actually asked to my community of practice colleagues here in Kingston recently. I was struck by a quote by a German artist who said, in terms of the sort of communal qualities of art. He said every person is an artist in some way or another, in a social sort of way. And so I asked my colleagues, in your spiritual care, in your practice of spiritual care, do you see yourself as an artist? It's just such an interesting question to me. And then to hear you say that for you, it is this creative act where you draw upon all these creative resources, and in the act of providing care, it sounds like you do see yourself as an artist. Would you agree with that? Is it that embodied for you?
I think I see all of us as artists. I think sometimes there's a way in which art gets really confined to certain professions and people. Yeah, I think I'm very interested in like expanding that definition. I mean, chaplains are constantly learning, deepening in the art of listening, in the art of conversation, in the art of ritual, in the art of prayer, in the art of even choosing what to wear on the unit, right? And sometimes I wear a purple sweater, and that particular sweaters, patients really seem to like it, right? And so, and I think also arts, creative practices tend to be very sustaining for people. And I'm a terrible visual arts, I say I'm quote unquote terrible at it. I think, but even saying that is sort of contributing to this idea that artists have to look a particular narrow way. I think a lot of chaplains I know are drawn to poetry, whether it's reading it or writing it, or music, or it could be gardening, or it could simply be someone who really likes to host dinner parties for big group or a small intimate group of people, or it could just be liking to be in nature. I think there's a particular artistic orientation or creative orientation that it to me just really runs through spiritual care. And I hope that more spiritual caregivers can acknowledge that aspect of themselves, just because I think that's worth celebrating and that it's worth honoring. And also that I think it's the way in which art inspires us. I think spiritual caregivers are really inspiring to a lot of people. And so it's sort of mutual, right? For others to see ourselves, I think as artists can be a kind of gift for others, which is to say they can draw inspiration, and that they can perhaps learn from you a little bit more about the art of listening, of conversation, of ritual, how to incorporate it in some small way in their own lives.
I want to ask you too about the art of language and what it means for you to be multilingual and to have this cultural appreciation, this window into cultures through language, and what that means for you as a writer, and perhaps specifically around the transformation of your written book into an audio book. And how did your relationship to the book change in recording the audio book for it? Was there anything in speaking it or hearing it that changed your relationship to the book? I'm just curious to know about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm always, my first book, here I have it here with me, Be the Refuge, was really based on 89 interviews with young adult Asian American Buddhists from different ethnic and different Buddhist backgrounds. And that was a lot of listening to other people's voices. And I did not read the audiobook for that book. But for this one, it was such a personal book. And I was given the opportunity to read the audiobook. And I'm someone who's always pretty much read my writing and read it out loud, and to just hear the rhythms of it and hear the verses. But doing the audiobook was a whole other level of spending 5 hours in a studio, realizing my voice was not accustomed to this level of reading. But it was very transformative for me. I think it just reminded me how much, within Buddhist thought, we talk about actions of body, speech, and mind. And I've always thought it was really interesting, both that mind was in there, our thoughts exert an impact on the world, but also speech, that it's kind of seen as a separate category, that it has a lot of power, the tone of voice that we use. I often think how a simple phrase can completely make someone's day totally better. And we might not ever know that happened, but just a simple way of the way we spoke to them. And conversely, a simple phrase that was spoken in a way that, maybe was, could really hurt someone, right? And so that really fascinates me. And so for this book in particular, I thought a lot about in hospital chaplaincy. I mean, the hospital where I worked at, I'm sure countless languages were spoken. And of course, we can't always have an interpreter in the room. And, I'm hardly fluent in the languages that I'm incorporating into this book. But one thing I was particularly interested in doing was incorporating just a little bit of other languages, because as the only Mandarin speaking person on our spiritual care team, I was often referred to the Mandarin speakers, and wanting to convey those bits in a way that also honored a little bit of the rhythms, the orality, if you will, of what those sounded like, right? Mostly this book is probably 99% English, but there are some Asian words, Asian scripts in it. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of what's out there will completely erase that altogether. It's seen as being inaccessible. And I think then we get these questions of inaccessible to whom, who's not being included into our stories of chaplaincy. And indeed, this book, is in a way indebted to other works about chaplaincy. I remember reading Kate Braystrup's wonderful memoir, Here If You Need Me, and really loving that book and all the vignettes she's told. And then also wondering, what would a Buddhist chaplain memoir look like, or an Asian American Buddhist chaplain memoir, which is to say, I bring my own theologies and sensibilities to it. Ellen Cooney has a really wonderful novel that she spoke about for the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, One Night, Two Souls Went Walking, which is, again, also a wonderful piece of work. And there's a few Buddhist chaplaincy memoirs out there, but I hadn't really seen one that, to me, started to capture, again, like the truth in the hospital, which is that there are so many languages there, only a very small fraction of which I can access, but maybe for the small fraction that I can access, what is it like to open up a little bit more of a window onto that?
Yeah.
And maybe I'll add just one more piece that, so much, it felt quite transformative to do this. Like I was not expecting at some point. I remember meeting a Shanghainese speaking patient and her husband. And I grew up with my parents speaking this dialect of Shanghainese, which is really mutually distinct from Mandarin. So it's really kind of a language in its own right. And it was a very interesting encounter because at that time I couldn't speak Shanghainese, but I understood it. So they were speaking to me in Shanghainese. I was speaking to them in Mandarin. And there was actually this incredible intimacy that was going on there. And fast forward to the pandemic years, I started learning how to speak it. Now my dad only speaks to me in Shanghainese, where before he spoke to me in Mandarin. And it's like, I joke, like it feels a bit like I have a brand new dad, but I think there's a way in which tapping a little bit more into language, and this is what I love about language, you don't have to be fluent, even if you just know one phrase or two phrases. There's this amazing way in which making that effort, trying, even butchering the pronunciation can actually be this way of opening and showing, I care, I want to learn, and I want to be, just in some kind of relationship. And that way, the way in which the language has deepened my intimacy, kind of my own appreciation of my parents being much more actually multilingual than I am, and bringing that more into spiritual care. So thank you. That's a very...
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm struggling to learn German myself, so I'm resonating with this. Suzanne, you have your hand up. Just, you want to jump in? Can't quite hear you. No. No. Do you want to type your question in the chat? Okay. Yeah, it shows you're not muted. I'm not sure why we can't hear you. It's frustrating.
Your preferences and look in the audio. It might be something there in your audio setting.
Okay.
Oh,
There you are.
Oh, that was magical. I came late to the party, so I'm sorry. I think I missed the first quarter of this wonderful talk and of your reading, and just a couple of thoughts, not so much questions, but just I'm so struck. I've been in I work at Kingston General in the spiritual health department here. And for the majority of my experience in spiritual health, my background is very much informed by Buddhist practice and Buddhist philosophy. And I thank you, Robert, it just delights me to hear spiritual care be spoken from a spiritual compass that is Buddhist informed, and to hear you talk about relating different doctrines, different ethics, different precepts to the work itself. I'm incredibly aware of how unique this hour is for me, Robert. so I'm so appreciative of you being here. Thank you so much for your presence. So there's that. And I was very aware of just the conversation when you started to talk about notions of self-care and how you linked that to the notion of non-self, how beautiful that was in terms of the interconnectedness and to look beyond self-care, moral distress, burnout, beyond beyond a spa day, beyond taking a week off, that it is far, far more connected to our families, our colleagues, systemic oppression, the societies that we live in, the structural violence that we have to work inside of. And then linking that as well, Robert, to bringing in the idea of being the artist inside of it. And I think that we are all, I agree. I think that we all have, we all play an incredibly important creative role in that sense. And my partner is an artist as well. And we have so many conversations around how the struggles that I engage with as a spiritual health practitioner working within a completely under-resourced medical system, and what she goes through trying to be an artist in a completely under-resourced profession, where we live in societies that don't necessarily on paper or in terms of our government, our funding models, value the work that we're doing and what it is to sort of exist inside of what is called quote unquote caring economies, or whatever the new phrases are for the arts, for health, and how to maintain our integrity, how to maintain our spiritual compass inside of that. So anyways, all of those things I have came pouring out of me as I was listening to you talk. Yeah. So thank you so much. It's a gift that you're here with us.
Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Yeah, wonderful. Other questions, comments, and I'll just repeat, if you'd like a free copy of Chenxing's book, I'm happy to send you one. I can have a little book raffle if you'd like to put your email address in the chat. The book's arriving tomorrow. Send them out. Chenxing, any questions for us if I just turn the tables? I mean, connecting with yeah, I'm just curious to know if you might have any questions for anybody online right now.
Yeah, oh gosh, there's so many. I'm trying to think, like, how do I pick just one question?
Yeah.
I guess I would be curious to hear, well, there's sort of questions about chaplaincy that I'm just really interested in, actually. And I feel I don't know really as much about chaplaincy in the Canadian context. So I'm both curious about that relationship with the US context, but I guess maybe just curious about what kinds of creative just offerings that you would like to see that would benefit the work. Or maybe another direction is also another way to answer this question is just, what directions would you like to see chaplaincy take? That's a very big project question. So I'm both curious about either very small specific answers or very broad answers there.
One of the projects I'm taking on is to learn more, or to read more deeply into disability justice, and what you were saying about, you're raising the profile or raising the voices of Asian American Buddhists. I mean, that interests me. Bringing more voices to the fore is a spiritual practice. Political, socio-political spiritual practice. It intrigues me.
And I feel in the US, over the pandemic, chaplains people are more aware of it, right? There was a Gallup poll that said 1 in 4 Americans had been served by chaplains. And I'm curious, in the Canadian context, are people quite familiar with chaplaincy? Does it really kind of depend? Do people have a particular notion of what chaplaincy is? Or is this word spiritual care more accessible to people?
Yeah, so that's an essential question for us. Anyone want to answer that?
I'd be happy to leap in. Oh,
Yeah.
you go. No, please, Adriana.
Well, I think I can give you an example. In our organization, we have chaplains in different campuses, and I think speaks volumes that people know you by name. And when you had a facility with 300 beds or 298 beds in long-term care, and people can point out to the chaplain on a specific unit by name, I think that's very telling of the services that you provide and perhaps the connection that you have with a interdisciplinary team. So I feel very valued and an integrated part of, the model of care that we provide here, Briere Continuing Care. And I think that speaks volumes of also hearing comments of other chaplains, other colleagues in the city, in different hospitals as well.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
One of the evolutions we're facing here in Ontario is this bi-professionalism of spiritual care practitioners, formerly known as chaplains, being also psychotherapists. And is spiritual care psychotherapy, yes or no? And that's the split identity crisis amongst chaplains is something that's just unique, ongoing in our profession, I think. And this is just adding to that conversation and debate. I think probably in the States, there's a clearer separation between spiritual care and psychotherapy. That's just my guess, but something here that we're trying to integrate and maybe even risk losing the spiritual care part towards more of the psychotherapy. One of the struggles, the professional identity struggles we're facing, I would say. I want to just call on Dan Moulton. I wonder if he's listening. Dan's a Buddhist in Sudbury, Ontario, and I know he would have lots of comments and would just love to ask a question or make a comment just before we run out of time, just to drawing on Dan a little bit. Dan.
Hey, Robert, thanks. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. And the last question you had, where you're talking about the impact of the pandemic and stuff. Well, here in Sudbury, we're a big part of the team. And one thing we did, I think sometimes it's just, we bring a human aspect when we talk to people more than all the rest of the team, I'll say. So here, it's a 30-bed ICU unit. It was hard for a while. No families were allowed in. It was very hard to have that connection. So myself and the social worker, because we can't see all 30, we kind of divided and conquer. And we each had a role, and we would sign. If something was more for me, she'd give to me. And if there's something more social work related, I'd give it. But we all made an effort to basically call families, see how they were doing, talking to them, just hear a voice, let them express what they're feeling. And we also made it that we had iPads. We got the units to buy it. So we'd go in the rooms and do a video call with these families so they could actually see their loved ones. Just having that, be able to see them. So I think, and the team here really knew and valued. Even now I get called for connections and stuff like that throughout the hospital. And we actually, well, Robert, we got that recognition there from that one award. And so it was quite powerful. And yeah, it was intensivists and stuff that put that forward. So it shows the value of chaplains here, I think, in Sudbury. And, as a Buddhist, and when I was listening to talk, I think I always reflect to, for me, the story of the Buddha with Ananda walking on a trail and finding the monk covered in sores. And he was going to a community, and the rest of the monks ignored. And it was the Buddha Ananda that cleaned the monk and did everything. And it's the saying, if you take care, if you take care of a fellow monk, you're taking care of me. Whoever you take care of, you're taking care of me. I think when I go in and when I see people, I'm always reminded, I think that comes in with me. It's so ingrained, and I find it so powerful to have that, not to be disgusted, not to be away. Whatever you walk into is to be fully present. Not be, fearful of touching. Often I find something I've learned, I'm not sure with death and dying, I know it's a big thing for chaplains, and in Buddhism too, there's different practices around that. I go in rooms sometimes and families are, if the wall was further apart from the bed or further, they'd be on they're right around, they're not even going near it. And sometimes, just walking in and putting your hand on the person, inviting them, simple things like that could be quite powerful. I guess that's my, some of my thoughts, Robert.
Thank you, Dan. I've found that to be, I always find that to be such a powerful story. I've actually seen that story depicted in temples, on murals, in temple murals in Cambodia.
Lovely. Well, thank you everyone for coming online today. It's lovely to connect with you and to hear your voices. I really appreciate the conversation, and I'm so grateful to you, Chenxing, for your time with us today. And I look forward to reading your book and sharing it with my colleagues and continuing this conversation informed by your wonderful writing and your books. And so thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.